Welcome to the Natural Wisdom Podcast. I'm Christine Backus, your host, and today is May 20th, 2024. And I have a really fun guest today, and that's Bethany Nicole. Hey, Bethany, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, we've got a lot of different, and we're going to try to draw the connection between them. We have a lot of different things to talk about today, and but before I get to that, I just want to point out that today is the day that the sun moved into Gemini. Gemini is the sign of the twins. It's a sign of dialogue, curiosity, and also like doing two or three things at one time. And so we've already been sitting here chatting and kind of going all over the map. So that may be what the podcast sounds like today.
Yes.
And yeah, so I want to just say a couple words about you, Bethany, and then you can fill in what I miss. But so Bethany, you've written now two books. You're on the process of finishing writing a second book. First one is called Apologies I Never Got, and this next one is called Secret Energetics of Relationships. Is that right?
Yes.
And that gives us a little bit of info on what you do. So I met you through the Compassion Key world, and you
Mhm.
and I were two of the only astrologers in that group. And then
Yes.
we've connected that way. And so Bethany is an astrologer. She specifically works on relationships and relationship astrology. And yeah, and then you and I have talked about a bunch of different topics, including Black Moon Lilith, which is one of those points in the chart that I don't use, but I find fascinating,
Yeah.
and astrocartography. And I want to, before I turn it over to you to kind of talk more about what you do, I also want to point out that you've been writing for a long time, so you're a writer, and then you've been featured in tons of magazines, tons of podcasts. And so you're really out there as somebody that can that people can come to learn about relationship astrology and relationships in general.
Yes.
So it's a kind of a weird circuitous introduction, but I wanted you to talk a little bit more about yourself and just kind of what you're up to.
Yeah, absolutely. It actually all kind of tracks because my MC line is in Gemini and my Venus is also in Gemini. So I have a lot of Gemini vibes both in work and personal life. And so it makes sense that I would kind of have a lot of things in publishing and a lot of my hands kind of in a lot of different areas. And then too with, Venus also being there, focusing a lot on relationships and how we interact with each other. I feel like it kind of all tracks along with my astrology for sure.
How did you get started? What did you first start in this world?
Yeah. I guess if you want to take it kind of all the way back, my degree is in philosophy, so that's what I studied, in school. Um, and that's really kind of where this all sort of comes from. A lot of astrologers are philosophers and vice versa. And just kind of getting into that world of metaphysics and thinking outside the box and just being kind of interested in the world around us and how it works and why are we here and what's operating behind the scenes. I feel like that was the genesis of everything. It's just kind of how I operate at base level, I feel like. But then as far as starting it and developing it into what it is now, I feel like I kind of did it, I think, a little bit backwards than maybe what most people do. I started with intuitive development and I utilized a lot of workshops, and I had a mentor, and I was doing a lot with kind of learning how to tune into energetics, learning how to put what I was feeling and seeing into words. And then from there, I went into tarot and oracle reading, and then astrology kind of tied in with all of that. So I feel like people usually do it the other way around, but I started kind of that way. And then astrology was actually more of like the last piece of the puzzle in a way. I mean, I'd studied it in school along with philosophy, so I had basic understanding. But as far as using it in sessions with clients, it was kind of the last piece of the puzzle.
That you know, it's so interesting the way you talk about it, because I think we forget, or at least I didn't realize until not that recently, that astrology is like a language of energy. right? That what
Mhm.
we're talking about is energetic patterns. And
Yep.
energy, of course, is now a word we can use without people just completely, eyes rolling back in their head. So
Yeah. Exactly.
yeah, that's very interesting that it's energetics, and that ties into the relationship work too, right?
Yeah, I felt like that's really what kind of connected the dots for me was, you were seeing somebody was kind of communicating with this energy and someone else was receiving it with this energy. And so it's happening. You just maybe don't have the language for it, or um, you're feeling it, but you're not really sure what it is. And then I feel like astrology gives us the blueprint and it gives us the language and it gives us the understanding. And it's like, you can just sort of pull up someone's chart or their synastry with somebody else and you can see right off the bat. I mean, it's like a cheat code for your own energetic blueprint. You're just seeing like, okay, this is what I'm working with. This is what my partner's working with. This is how it's presenting. This is, how you work with this energetic specifically. With some of the more high octane zodiac signs, you know when they walk into your room, right? You're feeling like, oh man, or if somebody's like, yeah, I'm in Aries, you're like, oh yeah, I get it. Like I see that, like that tracks, or Gemini's the same way, or some of these that have, very specific energetic blueprints. You're feeling it, it, you just don't always have the words for it until astrology helps you connect that dot. And then you're like, oh, I get it. And then there's a very specific way that you can handle Aries energy to work with you instead of against you. You learn, okay, if this is how I communicate, how do I work with that so that I'm being a leader in the areas I need to be a leader in, so that I'm breaking the barriers that I need to be breaking, but I'm not, you know, fire breathing down my entire personal life. Like you learn how to work very specifically because astrology's given you the blueprint for that. So I feel like it really does just all tie in together.
Yeah, I think who was it that said it was credited to Apollo that to the whole know thyself,
Yeah.
that
Hmm.
self and really knowing and understanding yourself, and I said yeah, so maybe you could say more about that in your specifically in your relationship work, and like what you've seen happen with couples when you bring this into the equation.
That's so funny you brought that up because that's literally a chapter in my new book. It's called Know Thyself. That's so funny. Yeah. And that's literally what the chapter is about, is the more that you get to know yourself and your partner and how they operate, the more, information is power. So you're able to actually control your own energetics. Because I think that's kind of the bottom level is awareness of it, and then you're kind of learning to work with it, and then the mastery of it where you're kind of channeling it where you want it to go. Now you're creating your own reality. Now you're the master of your own, you know situation, your own paradigm. You're creating that yourself. And so I think that's, a huge piece of it.
What have you got a story that you can tell without portraying confidences about how this has worked either in your life or in life of a client about that? Because it's to me it's fascinating because I wish I'd known both
Mhm.
times I was married. I wish I'd known more about my own energetic patterns and then the energetic patterns of the people I was with, or had a language and a way to like to take action, some practical ways of working with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I use Aries because I am Aries, so it's the one I obviously work with the most in my own life. But it's also the ones I get a lot of because again, some of these, higher octane ones or just the ones that aren't, fitting into our society, as it stands right now, right? Like the ones that fit in more would be like kind of this grounded Taurus energy. Capricorn, is very 9 to 5 oriented. They kind of fit more into that paradigm than, say an Aries or whatever. So I get a lot of clients who operate maybe differently than the norm, and they feel a lot of shame or blame around that. And so I think that's a big part too, is that even just taking that off the table and the awareness of like, no, this is just like how you're these are your default settings. Like this is where you're operating from. It's like your operating system. This is just where you're starting from. So I think with that, you can see, for example, as an Aries, my communication is very fiery. The way I process emotions is very fiery as well. Like I, kind of burn through them very quickly, and then I'm just sort of over it and like on to the next thing. But that's an important process for me to do that. But for example, with my friends that are cancers, that's not an easy path for them to take with me. And so I've really learned, you kind of learn which people you're going to mesh with on certain areas. And especially in relationships, you learn not necessarily that you can't be with that person at all, but more like, how do I put a nice little filter through this so that I'm not blowing this person away, or that I'm not, you're learning how to work with their energetics to create a relationship that works for everybody, that's very synergetic, as opposed to, but the same is true on the opposite side. Like, to me, Cancer feels very emotionally heavy. So it feels like a wet blanket to me if they're kind of, you know, rehashing something their ex-boyfriend said to them 10 years ago. I'm like, oh my God, I can't with this. Like, so that's me having to learn to hold boundaries with them on that side. It's them having boundaries of maybe not being a good vessel for me to vent to. So you learn how to have that relationship work for everybody. And you learn, okay, like, fellow fire signs, those are my people that I go to when I'm in kind of a higher emotional state, or I want a solution, or I'm just looking to kind of hash out a problem. That's kind of where I go to, because it's a more natural setting for both people involved. It's not about shame or blame. Like, there's nothing wrong with the way Aries does it. There's nothing wrong with the way Cancer does it. Do you maybe want to marry each other? Like, probably not. Do you maybe want to try to force this like super close friendship where you tell each other everything? Like, maybe not. But yeah, I think if you are in a marriage, was an Aries or a Cancer, you would just learn, again, kind of how to use those filters, or how to work with them together so that it's not draining anybody, it's not creating discord. But if you don't know how to do that, and you just think like, oh my gosh, this person's such a wet blanket, or they're thinking about you like, oh, they're just so fiery, that there's such a problem, they're this or that, then you're not ever going to learn how to work together. You're just going to continue to blame each other, not seeing that it could just be actually that dance of your energetics together that isn't the best mesh.
Yeah, so I have two questions that come up out of that. One is, well, maybe one's less of a question and more of a kind of a follow-on, is that one of the things that you're pointing out that I think is so important and such a gift of astrology is that in this culture we tend to judge and blame everybody, right? And
Mhm.
well, and in fact, even in my old corporate days, we used to do these personality assessments, one of which was based on the elements. I didn't know
Mhm.
that until recently. And then there was all this, you could tell there was all these like judgments sometimes under the surface about one being better than the other.
Yeah.
And your example is perfect, right? Aries, fire, Cancer, water. Well, we need both, but
Yeah,
they operate
exactly.
differently. Yeah. And so I
Mhm.
think one of the things that I love about what you're saying, and what I've found astrology to be so useful for, is to kind of let go of the one is good and the other is bad. And if you're clashing with somebody, there's something wrong with them or something wrong with you, if you
Right.
internalize. And so that I wanted to call that out. But then I wanted to say that I guess the question I have to follow up on that is, you're talking primarily about sun signs, but I know that you look at, all, who knows how, well, in fact, I know you look at a lot of planets, even some points that I don't look at, like Black Moon Lilith.
Mhm.
And I want to lead you a little bit, because I think it's really easy for people to get sort of stuck in, is my sun sign compatible with that
Yeah.
sign? And I wonder if you could talk about, again, sort of your experience about all the other elements of the chart, the other planets. And maybe that'll segue us into the Black Moon Lilith stuff, because I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, yeah, basically there's so many layers to synastry and how we show up in relationships, but usually when people start, the sun sign is, and the elements of their sun sign is like step one. It's not the be all end all. It's not like you can't go past that step, but it's a good, just kind of, everyone can figure it out. It's very across the board. You know how fire and water act, you know how, earth and air act. You kind of can figure that out just from a very basic knowledge of the planet we live on, right? So that's where I tell people to kind of start, just to give you an idea of how that could be interacting. And then you start going into, you have the top three. So you have the sun, moon, rising. The moon sign plays a big part, obviously, because it's our emotional piece. So in relationships, that's kind of our emotional default sometimes in what we want out of them, how we show up in them, when things are going well, when things are going poorly, how do we show up? That can really play a big part in that. And then you also have Venus, the planet of love and relationships, which is another big one because it really just shows a little bit of your relationship path and kind of how you operate in them. So for example, like mine's in Gemini, and I notoriously do not have a type. I have dated like any type you can think of. I've dated that, and that's a very typical Gemini quality, to kind of want to try everything and be in different types of relationships and kind of go from them. Some of them are much quicker. It's like, oh, okay, that was cool, and now what? So that can kind of be how your Venus sort of guides your relationship life. And then of course, Mercury, the planet of communication, that's another big one in looking specifically at how you're communicating. My Mercury is also in Aries, so I have a lot of that fiery communication as well. So it's very important for me to have partners that have some fire energetic or earth energetic that can really hold that space for me with these higher octane emotions. So you're definitely looking at all of those. Then you can start also getting into the Chiron, the wounded healer, and then the Black Moon Lilith is another one, because it can really affect how you show up in your relationships, what you're exiling, what you think you can't bring to the table, especially with the feminine. It's not just feminine, it can also be masculine, but definitely you can see if somebody is really struggling with holding their own authority in relationships, or they're afraid to speak up in relationships, or they feel like they're coming across a certain way. You can kind of look and see like, oh, okay, this is something the Black Moon Lilith is hanging on to, or this is something you've exiled or you were taught, you're reacting to something you were taught, or something along those lines. You can see where the wounding in those arenas might live.
Talk a little bit about just your understanding of the meaning, the big picture meaning of Black Moon Lilith, and like what it is, because and some of the people listening to this are going to be familiar with a lot of these astrology terms. And for some people, it'll be, a little bit more out there. But Black Moon Lilith is one that you just don't see that much about. Even when people, even with astrologers that are using a lot of the asteroids, I still don't see Black Moon Lilith included that often. So I'm curious, A, what drew you to it? B, like what your understanding is of what it is, and then
Mhm.
a little bit more about your experience with it.
Yeah, I don't even remember the moment really that I was drawn to it. I think it just kind of came into my experience, and I felt like it really resonated. And then I was seeing it showing up a lot in clients' charts as being very accurate as to what was going on with them. And then I think it just kind of locked in that way. But what it really represents, is kind of that dark feminine, dark goddess. It can also kind of represent the wounded feminine, the aspects of that energy that we've sort of exiled from ourselves or put into shadow. It's the shadow side of the feminine. It's based on the archetype of Lilith, which was, mythologically speaking, Adam's first wife in the Garden of Eden, and they were considered to be made of the same thing. So he was made from dirt, she was made from dirt, earth. And in the traditional with Adam and Eve, it's, Eve was made from Adam's rib, so it's kind of a different paradigm than, so he and Lilith were considered equals. And then the myth goes that she refused to submit to him, so she was cast out of the Garden of Eden. So she's basically the archetype of that very empowered, very sexual, very in control of herself and her own authority female. So she's very independent, she's very strong, she's very speaking her mind, she's not necessarily bending to the will of anyone else. And so that's kind of the archetype, but obviously that's not an aspect that's always celebrated in our society. Even in the story, right? She was too bold, and so they cast her out, and then they made someone that would get along with Adam better, right? So that's obviously a story to represent something else, but or depending on what you believe, I guess. But she's also really depending on what tradition you're going in, there are even now she's like kind of demonized in a lot of ways. Like there are traditions that are like, oh, she's, um, she's just very negative. She's very dark. She's very this. And, Eve would be put on the platform as like, oh, this is what you want to be. Um, so that's kind of how she shows up in mythology, and that's kind of how she shows up in astrology. She's showing us where are the pieces of your empowered feminine that could be wounded, that could be hidden, that could live in the exile, that could live in the shadows. Because even within our own families, right, it doesn't even have to be the bigger society. It could be something like if in your family being, I mean, I've even seen, there was one that a client that I had that it was like her humor, like her comedy was exiled into the Black Moon Lilith because her family was very military, very serious. And so when she was like kind of clowning around and being seen and being out there, they didn't like that. And so they really taught her like, that's not ladylike, that's not, um, I think they even said to her, no men will love you if you do that. Like, it was just the weirdest kind of stuff. But, you could see, I guess, if it was a very old school, stern family, that maybe they just didn't value that quality in her. And so she really exiled it. And now it's coming out as her re-embracing that and doing stand-up comedy and doing things like that. But it was just like an entire chunk of herself that she had exiled, and that kind of exile creates a wound because you can feel something's missing. And then sometimes too, you can even kind of react to that and sort of lash out at that, and you see it as like resentment or jealousy, or you see another female being a stand-up comedian and you kind of feel that resentment or that jealousy, and it sort of drives your life in a little bit. So you're almost polarizing yourself away from the very thing that you want. And that's sort of the Black Moon Lilith in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's a great description. And if I remember right, it's not a physical body. It's got something to do with the placement of the moon.
Yeah, it's the dark side of the moon, basically, like the darkest point away from the Earth at the time of birth. So yeah, it's not a physical, it's not a planet, it's not a star, it's just kind of a location. So
Right.
literally dark, the pieces that we hide, our deepest, darkest shadows, our subconscious, the places that we hide, and what a lot of people use it for, what a lot of astrologers also use it for. I use it kind of, with the relationship piece, but I also use it, you can see a lot of hidden gifts as far as you can also use it as like the witch wound. You can see it as a witch wound. It's something that these feminine gifts that we have, not necessarily just feminine, but the more feminine archetype ones of intuition or psychic or mediumship, all of that can live in there too, because obviously those are not accepted, or that could even come in from a past life as the witch wound. Like, how many lifetimes have you been burned at the stake for this gift? And then you're like, there's no way I'm touching it in this lifetime. So you can also see that. So sometimes when people learn to unlock that, now they, let loose all of these gifts. You can have everything from being a psychic to being a comedian, like there's just all kinds of things that she can hold on to. She's very much the archetype of, our triggers are our treasures. So whatever's, she's kind of holding on to is actually usually a really beautiful gift for people to empower themselves with.
I love that saying, our triggers are our treasures. Yeah, that's I was thinking about Chiron the other day, and it's very Chiron like what you're talking about. And what I thought about with Chiron is it's your gift is in your weird,
Yeah, definitely.
right? So it's the same, it's like a piece of that kind of, yeah, like the things that you're, yeah, the things that you're disowning are often your gifts. That's a great
Mm-hmm.
saying it, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I'm kind of wanting to go a little bit to another topic now and then try to pull them all together.
Mm-hmm.
Because, in fact, we started talking about this at the beginning before we started recording. you said that you've seen other astrologers that do love and relationships, and then they also do location astrology, which is something you do as well. You're one of the few people I know that does location astrology. And we were trying to talk about the connections, which I think we'll come to, but wanted you to talk for a few minutes about how you made that journey from, being so focused on relationships and relationship astrology, and then going into the location astrology, which I think the proper term astrocartography.
It is, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I really started with it as just kind of an add-on piece to my own clients, because they were kind of, it seems like as you start these transformations and relationships, especially if you're single and you're looking, sometimes it's just like, am I not in the right space for this? Like, am I not in the right place? Like, should I move back to here? I mean, I just feel like the vibe is different here. Or same with money or whatever it is. It seems like that was coming up a lot. So that's kind of what led me to it. And then I kind of got trained, and then, did a lot of research on it, read a lot of books, even though there's really not a lot of books about it. It's really a very small arena, comparatively. And so I was just doing it as like an add-on for my clients. And then I was like, wow, this is really effective. Like, this is really, there's some real magic behind it, because it would be, we'd pull up their charts, and it was like they would be living within like 5 miles of one of their lines. And it's like, how, you can't even make this stuff up. They're like, did you draw those on? I'm like, no. And then how would I know where you lived when you were 7 to do it? It's like, you just put it in and it creates this chart. And they're like, oh my gosh, that's so weird. I went to college there. And it's like right on top of one of their lines. And it's just like, there's so much magic in it. And it really is describing people's experiences of living in certain locations. And you really do see, once you kind of tap into it, sort of the magic behind it. And so it really could affect. I mean, I felt like, there were people that were doing everything right, quote unquote. Their astrology in general looked, fine. You're kind of getting to a point where like, I don't know what the problem is. Like, I don't know. And then you're looking at their astrocartography and you're like, oh, you were living on just this really gnarly line. Like, of course you're not going to be drawing in a lot of like relationship stuff along that. So it just started kind of that way. And then it just sort of evolved into its own thing. But yeah, it was like we were talking about, it's really strange because the few other people I do know that do it the same way. They also do love and location. And I'm not entirely sure, I guess, because they're so tied, or I was saying too, it's almost like you're having a relationship with the place you live. Your energetics are interacting with it. So it is a bit like having, kind of a relationship. And I do joke, I used to live in Los Angeles, and I always joke about that we had a bad breakup, and we're not on speaking terms right now. And I'm really mad at it. And if it wants me to come back, it's going to have to try really hard. And so, I think you could see that there are some connections, I guess, between relationships and that type of astrology and what's showing up in the places that you live, and how that could affect, how you show up to relationships or what you want during that time. Even like, I liken it to, when people are living on a Saturn line, it makes me think of, kind of if you were in like medical school or doing a residency, like you're just so focused on your lessons right then that you're maybe not looking to bring in a relationship. It's just like not a good time for you. Not that you can't, but that most people, during something really intense like that, are just like, let me just get through this. And then on the other side, I'll be a doctor and I can marry and have freedom to focus on a relationship. So I kind of liken it to that. Like when, people are on specific lines, it's like, maybe you're just there to kind of do this thing, learn this lesson, and then you're going to move on to something that's a little bit more filled with ease. And maybe that would be a better time for a relationship. And working in the reverse, that is what people see a lot. They're like, oh yeah, like, I couldn't have brought on a relationship when I lived there. Like, I just had so much going on with my family and so many tough things happening. And you're like, maybe that was just the time for that. And, now you're moving towards a line that's going to bring in something a little bit different.
Have you noticed it in your life where when you broke up with LA, how it changed your life, for instance?
Yeah, absolutely. And it made a lot of sense because it's along a Mars line of mine. So it would be that difficult severing, that kind of like, don't ever talk to me again, that sort of, bad breakup scenario. And I definitely see, I've always lived within 5 to 10 miles of a line on my chart. Every place I've ever lived has been within that. They haven't been pleasant lines always, but there have been lines there. So I've definitely seen it track, and just even the way that, for example, I also had sun on my MC line, I think. Yeah, sun on my MC line there with the Mars. Um, and that was how I felt in LA a lot. Like I really stepped into my writing career, I stepped into doing what I do, and that was where my intuitive development stuff, I mean, all of that was in LA. So in a lot of ways, I felt like I was really being seen and coming out of my shell and just like stepping into like, this is who I am and this is what I do, because that's not what I was doing before that. So it always felt like such a mixed experience of, like I feel like in so many ways, this is like who I am and how I want to be seen. But then I was also having really weird experiences, like with the Mars separation, like even things that I felt like shouldn't have been that high octane of separation. Like it was just like friend falling outs, like really gnarly breakups, even like job separation. Like it was just like, I don't even know how to explain it. It's just like more aggressive than it should be. Like even if it was like a 2 weeks notice, or I don't know, it was just like a good riddance feeling, which is that Mars severing of like, we're done here, and you're just like, I don't even understand. Like it wasn't that bad of a situation, but the ending was just so abrupt and like intense. And um so I felt like it was such a mixed bag there. And then I also had Uranus along my IC line, which I also have in my chart. So that was a big double doozy of, having to, I moved like 5 times, I think, while I lived there. I mean, it was just like, just the weirdest stuff. Like I moved into a place and the roommate was like, I had been there 30 days and she was like, oh, I'm moving to San Francisco with my boyfriend. You're going to have to find a new place to live. And you're like, you could have told me this a month ago, like before I moved in here. It would just be really abrupt, weird things like that. But then in other ways, you're like, but I feel so seen here. Like, I don't understand. But every line that was near that, it just completely mimicked it just summed up everything I was feeling about it. And it made so much sense as to why I could never really get a grasp on, is it good that I'm here? Or is it bad that I'm here? Should I leave? Should I stay? Like literally after 6 months of being there, I was always on that fence of like, is this okay? And when I saw the astrocartography for it, I was like, oh my God, that's exactly how it felt to live there. Like that's exactly my experience.
That sounds, I think you've described both Uranus and Mars very well. The Uranus, oh, out of left field, something crazy just happened and it's everything's changing. And then Mars
Yeah.
on aggression. Yeah.
Yeah. And on that IC line where it's such an uncomfortable place for those big disruptive changes to be happening, like where you're just constantly going through those cyclings. And to already have my own placement of that, it just felt like, just double dose of it. It's like it just felt very, very strong.
Yeah, it's funny. I know like this much about it, about astrocartography. And the one thing I know about my own chart is my Neptune line runs through India, through the eastern portion of India. And that's where I've had the most amazing spiritual experiences and where I really, kind of got that whole part of myself developed was when I spent basically 7 months out of a year and a half in that country. It was amazing. And,
Yeah.
and I mean, that's the only thing I know about my astrocartography. And it's the only line that I could see that connection with, but it was a very literal connection with Neptune, right? The Neptune
Yeah.
spirituality, connecting to all that is. It's where I finally started to understand energy and things like that, all the things I couldn't see.
Yeah.
Biggest
Yeah. That's what you have
experiences
to
with it.
decide. Yeah. And that's kind of the key, I think, too, with it is, that it really, people see the lines and they think like, oh, that's a good line, that's a bad line, but it really just depends on where it
Right.
is, because your Mars on your MC line, that's not as bad, right? Like that's like you're breaking barriers in career, you're maybe pushing past glass ceilings, like you're really stepping into that, versus if you have Mars going along that IC line, you're looking at, again, kind of more aggressive, like breakups, I mean, home and family stuff, friendships, like it's just a little bit of a different, not that you can't like work with that, but just kind of generally speaking. And so I think that's, kind of the nuanced pieces of it is depending, Saturn on your different places in your chart is going to feel very different. Saturn, when you're talking about career or you're talking about lessons or learning or different things, you want to be kind of along that line, but you don't always want it, it's not always the coziest when it's like in your personal arena, or and that's really, and then it too, like how the lines interact with each other and when they're crossing and all of the things are kind of the nuances of um how it works. One of the cool ones, I wish I remember exactly what the line placements were, but I had a client who had like kind of a lot of attraction to the Philippines or something along those lines, and just felt very charged around it, I guess. Like she was like, yeah, it was just a weird experience while I was there. And I want to say, I wish I remember the line placements, but it was basically like what I was reading from it. I was like, yeah, it seems like you would have some severing. There's definitely some Mars. And I was like, maybe like fights with family about money, like maybe even just a falling out with family around finances. And she was like, that is the weirdest thing, because my brother and I I cut him off financially when we took our trip to the Philippines. It's like that nuanced with the way those lines connected. It was a literal severing of their finances and a falling out in a way, because they she said it was that Mars energy of like a big fight and that breaking apart. And then when they left and came back to the US, they were able to kind of like form a new relationship, but it was exactly the way that played out. And it's like it's just very interesting that it can get that nuance, like it tells that much of a story of what it's going to feel like to you, even to the point like with the Mars piece, right? Like it wasn't, like a calm, quiet discussion. It was very aggressive, and it was very like two, magnets being opposed to each other. It was very like severing. And then when they came back, they were able to come back in a different way, but it just created a completely new relationship from them, which is probably why they kind of felt that draw, because there was maybe something energetically between them, that was off, where she felt like she was always like bailing him out and giving him money, and he was maybe not appreciative of it, or that's how she felt. And so for her, the relationship improved a lot after that breaking, because they were able to come back more as equals, as opposed to like this kind of unbalanced scenario. So you're like, oh, okay, I could see why that would be, why maybe we're both drawn there and why that was a positive thing overall. But you could see why it felt exactly the way it felt and why that story played out.
I always am, even after having done astrology for all these years and working with so many clients on my own chart, I don't know why I'm surprised, but I'm often just surprised when things are totally literal.
Yeah.
But where the language that comes out of your mouth about the planets and the signs and the interactions completely and perfectly mirrors and reflects somebody's experience, and vice versa. And a lot of
Yeah.
times when I do readings for clients, they'll tell me what's going on, and as soon as I hear the words, I'm like, oh yeah, that's what this is, and that you just did
Yeah.
perfect way to explain, a Chiron return or whatever it was. And
Hmm.
so you've added a whole new dimension basically to your astrology practice.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really cool for people too, because I think like for the clients, because when we pull up their charts, they're looking at kind of a mess of just a general astrology chart. They don't know what they're looking at, and you're interpreting it for them. And you can point to things, but they're kind of like, yeah, okay. Like
Right.
I see that circle. Like I kind of get it, right? But I think what has been really cool for me with astrocartography is um people can see it. They can see like, oh my God, that's like, there's a line right through where I went to college, or there's like, I live 5 miles from that line right now. Like it's something, even if they don't know exactly maybe what it means or the nuances, like it is something really cool that and they're telling me too, right? They're telling me like, that is so weird. I've always felt drawn there. That is the weirdest thing. That's where I went for this vacation, or I lived there till I was 7. And then, it's always like they're able to interpret it in a lot of ways too. Like they're able to see more of what we see than sometimes even with their own chart, where they're just looking at a bunch of symbols they maybe don't understand. These are like very clear lines that they can get really excited about and see for themselves. And I think that's kind of one of the cooler things. And I always get like, that is so creepy. Like, how did you do that? I'm like, I don't make these by hand. Like I put it in and this is what comes out. But I think that's kind of the fun thing for people too. Like, and it brought a different dimension for me as a practitioner too, to be able to kind of share that with people, and they can get really excited and see for themselves like kind of how this plays out. And it gives them, validation, because a lot of the time that is what they're saying is like, I just always felt this really weird pull to this area. And then you're seeing like kind of the depiction of that, of like, there's a line right there and it's very strong, and, it makes sense. Or, how close they live to a current line. I, practiced with some of my friends before I really started, charging, like just to get the practice. And yeah, I have a friend who lives literally like probably 3 miles off of one of her lines, and she was just like, and she's not that huge into astrology, and she was like, is this witchcraft? Like, how does that work? Like, how does people know that? And it's like just the weirdest, but it's exciting. Like, it's a cool thing to see. I think people get really pumped about it, so that's kind of a fun thing.
Well, and it actually, as you say that, and that whole joke about is it magic or witchcraft or whatever, I think it brings me back to the conversation we were having sort of at the beginning about energy, right? Because
Yeah,
by now I think we're all familiar with the quantum physics, everybody is energy, everything is energy, and
yeah,
every place has its own energy, right? And we
yeah,
know that has its own weather, it has its own vibe, is what we used to call energy. And so it only makes sense that our inner blueprint would have like some, like would kind of co-create a
mhm.
particular situation or a particular feeling or whatever with the energy and the vibe of different locations.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost the next level a little bit, I feel like, because it's like thinking we take our energy to a place, and it's like the energy also of the place also is
Yeah,
interacting with us back. So that is, I guess, kind of the relationship between the two. So that would kind of, I guess, make sense of the love and location. But yeah, I think that's just even a higher concept than what we've been operating under for a long time, is that like, that it has its own energy and it's
right.
interacting with us in a lot of ways. And that's kind of a weird but cool new thing. I mean, it's not new, I guess, but the way it's becoming more mainstream is really interesting, because when I started researching it, there's like 2 or 3 books on it, like, and that's it. I mean, and if you look at just general astrology, there's hundreds, right? And this is like 2 or 3 books, and 2 of them are by the same guy. So it's like,
Isn't
you know,
fairly new? Isn't astrocartography fairly new? I mean, was this something that was practiced back in like Hellenistic times? Do you know?
I don't know. The books themselves and kind of the more, I don't know if it was passed down in other ways, but they're all kind of, the resurgence of it, if it was ancient, was more in the 70s, and then it's kind of grown from there. But I think it's still really, I think we're still figuring, honestly, I think we're still figuring a lot about it out, because even in the books, I mean, that's kind of astrology in general, I guess. There's kind of conflicting opinions, but there's also things like how like far do the lines reach. And so some books are like, oh, it's 300 miles, and then others are like as long as you feel it. Like there's no definition. And then there's, the concept that this line is more beneficial towards the east, or you're going to feel it more that way, but then you're still, so, there's the concept like, oh, well, you won't feel it at all to the west, but then there's other concepts, and in practice, it's like, no, you still feel it, but maybe it's it's
Right.
maybe less. But those are kinds of the things that are still a little bit up for debate, I would say, because there's not, and that's some astrology in general, I guess, there's not really ever a defined, I mean, I guess some things, but for every one opinion, you're going to get two or three contradictions. And
I think
I
that's
mean, yeah, you see that with like relationship compatibility with the signs. You can say, for every oh, this is a perfect pairing, you're going to get two or three that are like, well, this is why it's not, or this is,
right.
so it's like, I think we're still kind of figuring it out, but astrocartography for sure has, I think, some places that it could, we could learn some new things about it.
Well, to me, that goes back to a couple of things. One is that I've said this on times, and I'm sure you do too, is you always have to trust your own experience.
Right.
Right. You have to trust your own experience, and I don't think it's ever a good idea to let an astrologer or anybody else tell you what the right answer is for you. But we can offer great guidance, but it's about not giving your power away. And the
Yeah.
other thing that makes me think about too is that we live in a culture that thinks there's one right answer.
Right. Right.
So we think that, well, so if this astrologer doesn't agree with that astrologer, one of them has to be wrong,
Yeah.
because we think that's the way, science works. And of course, what we've learned over the last 4 years is that no, I mean, science has never worked that way. But now
Mhm.
we've seen pretty good evidence that no, there's not like one view of the world, there's not one right answer. And so, yeah, that's what
Yeah.
we think about. And so one of the questions I had for you too, is how would somebody get started to learn a little bit, or to kind of see if they can like just, play around with it without, I mean, obviously one thing is to come to a professional and get a reading, and that I think that's always going to be the best. But if you're just wanting to kind of get a start and play around, have you looked at like astro.coms?
Yeah, that's what I use. That's really, to me, that's the most user friendly, that's the most accurate. And I do send them, the link for it when we're done with our sessions, and let them kind of play around with it too and see. And it does give, and that would be the place to start for sure. And it does give, like you can click on the lines and it will give you at least a general breakdown of what they are and what they mean. So if you don't have any experience, it's going to give you at least a starting point. It doesn't talk about how they interact with each other, and it doesn't go into some of the more nuances, but I think just, it's going to give you like basics. Is this a beneficial line? Is this not? Is this like a tougher one? Is this an easier one? That can get tricky when there's multiple lines, because not that they cancel each other out, but they can interact in ways that maybe make a line less favorable than what its natural state would be. Or and then also too, the big thing is that I do their regular chart and then I do their astrocartography, so I'm seeing how that might interact with them personally, which obviously that is not doing. It's just giving you kind of the blueprint. So like what I talked about with my Uranus on my own IC line, and then my experience of that, of moving to an area that had that as well, that was, really intense and doubled up, right? There could have been, if I had, let's say, a Venus along my IC line, that might have tempered it down a little bit versus amped it up the way that I felt it. So I do look at their, and it gives me a hint too of just, if you have this in your IC line or this on your MC line, and you're going to a place where your sun is on your MC line, this is probably what's going to make that shine. So, that would be a really, if you, I don't know, have something like Gemini on your MC line, and you go to a place where the sun is on your MC line, then you're looking at that arena being really put in the spotlight. I saw it with one that was interesting was it was the sun on their descendant, and they had Venus on their descendant. So it was like they personally had Venus on their descendant, and then the place they had gone to had the sun on their descendant, and it was like their love life was put way in the spotlight in a way they didn't appreciate, because it was like they were like coworkers with the person, and it became like very public. And she said it felt a bit like being a celebrity, but in kind of a way you don't want, because it's like everyone's really focused on your personal relationship, and the sun, like the spotlight was really on that. And so she said it was like it was very uncomfortable because it was just highlighted to that point. And so it's like that's interesting, because you would need to know that she had Venus on that to begin with, and then seeing the sun along that. Because if you didn't know that information, you might think, because generally speaking, the sun on the descendant, I mean, you could see that as putting your personal life in the spotlight a little bit. You could see it that way. You could also see that in a more beneficial way, I guess. But to know that she already had Venus there, you're like, oh, that's a double dose of your relationship specifically is going to be, your love life specifically is going to be really highlighted by that energetic. And for her it was, and it caused, I guess, kind of the end of the relationship, because it was like, if you're not a celebrity and you're not used to your love life being like on blast like that, you're not gonna really, and in a work setting, you're like, I don't enjoy this. Like, this is not,
It's
this
it's a really good example of how things could cut both ways, right? Just because we think it's good, right, to have a spotlight on something, or I think about Jupiter, everybody thinks Jupiter is going to bring like,
right.
yeah, Jupiter's supposed to always bring good luck, but it just makes things bigger. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's not.
Right.
What I was gonna, there was something, let me see if I can get it back. There was something really interesting I wanted to take off with that. Oh, I know what it was, is that, especially, and this has been on my mind because I think astrology is changing so fast right now with the advent of AI. You can go, and you've always been able to go just look up your horoscope or look up an interpretation, and you can still, you could go get an app and get interpretations. And people sometimes ask me, well, why would you get a reading? Well, you've named it, right? Just because an AI can write all these things about, here's what the sun in Gemini means, and here's what your Venus and whatever means. What you talked about is that ability to sort of synthesize the whole chart, and in this case, put the layers together. And that, I think that's just, plus if you're with a person who's doing that reading for you, then you can sort of tune in and decide what you like, what you don't like, and then they can work with you on it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think it's our interpretation. That's what I think we're being, what our gifts are, what we're being paid for. It's kind of our own perception of it, our own interpretation of it. That's going to be very unique to the person you're going to, and looking at it through whatever filter, everyone has their fields of expertise in it. And I think that's really unique as well, and not something that AI is going to be able to give you, or in a way, I think, to take it and put it into context of like, now what do I do with this information? Okay, this is like what the sun in Gemini means, but how does that help me communicate with my partner? You know what I mean? Like, we can help take that and put it into, and especially with astrocartography, there's a lot of like, oh, so I have to move to that line in order to access it. And that's where, our interpretation can say like, no, there's other ways to access it. That's not something an AI is necessarily going to give you or help you understand, or whatever. I think it's the layers, and it's our interpretation. We've also seen how it plays out over and over, and so we learn kind of our own tricks of the trade, I guess. Like, we kind of see how it interacts as it's playing out in the reality, I guess, because you can see, somebody has the sun in Gemini and this is what that generally means, but we all know that people can be kind of on the spectrum of Gemini, of how much Gemini-ness you're, putting out there. So what do you do with that, And I think that's where, where our interpretation is really going to be the key for, you kind of get what you pay for. So if you just looked it up for free on,
Right.
Google, then you're going to get a very basic interpretation. If you are paying us, you're going to get a very unique, individualized, specific one. And if you're trying to implement changes in your relationship or figure out how to, work with your Saturn, or if you want to move somewhere, if you want to do all of that, you really it's not a place you want to skimp, right? This is how do you want to live your life? Some areas that I feel like you don't want to bottom of the barrel it. You want kind of the boutique experience of somebody telling you this is specifically how you work with this energetic to get the exact specific result you want,
Right. Right. Yeah, I love that. Well, I'm thinking, I was just trying to figure out what else, let me ask you, what else would you want to cover today as we kind of come to the end of our hour together? Was there anything else that our conversation brought up for you, or something else you want to sort of stress? Because we've covered the waterfront, right? Relationships.
We have.
They're
Yeah.
connected to me, but
Yeah. I mean, I think we've really summed it up. I think, it really is learning. I think the coolest part of everything that we're talking about is that we're learning to access our world in different ways, and we're learning how to work with it instead of against it. And
uh,
I think that's really going to create different realities and feelings for us and capabilities, to not feel, because that's one of the things too that we, when you're talking about moving, or you're talking about this or that, or if you're in a relationship or whatever it is, the biggest thing is you feel so disempowered in some of these scenarios. You're spinning your wheels, or you're I don't know how to make this decision, or, and now we're being given tools that allow us to get some of that information, to take some of that unseen and make it seen, so we can make higher decisions and learn again to work with these energetics, because that's so much of what we see in difficult life situations are people working against their natural.
right.
You see an Aries in a 9 to 5 job who's just clawing the walls, and they're looking around going, everybody else seems fine. I don't know why this is, happening. And it's this is not your specific energetic. This matches these people. So they're doing fine. This is not you. This is a different scenario. And I think that's giving us more power to choose our reality and to choose, and it's just taking us to, better life experiences and higher heights of what we're capable of in our own evolution. And, if we're not sitting there fighting against ourselves all the time and trying to talk ourselves into things, or, I mean, even with moving, it's what are you going to do? Move to a place and then see if it works, then move to another place and see if it works. When you're given an actual blueprint of, you may not want to go there. You may, or why don't you visit it first and see how that feels for, a couple weeks. You're being given information that otherwise it would be trial and error, so
Right.
how much faster are you evolving if you're not moving to the wrong place, or if you're not having the same discussion with your partner over and over? You're actually moving more towards, evolution. I guess this is maybe a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I always kind of think of it as with a monkey trying to open a nut. They're trying a stick. Okay, the stick doesn't work, and now they're trying a rock, and they're this kind of worked, and then they're trying something else, and it's if you were given a blueprint of then the next monkey knows from the first monkey's trial and error. But it's if you just started at this is what works, how much faster are you evolving as far as your abilities? And you're moving on to other things, and you're just able to not have to sit there and try all these different methods to figure out how to get this nut open, when you're being told this is how you do it, and this is the way that's going to work. And then you're like, great, now I can do something else with my time. Like, instead, now
Yeah.
I can enjoy this nut instead of spending hours trying to get at something that we could have cut the time in half on, you know?
And it's so much about what works for you, right? And that's, yeah, but, and again, without any blame.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with that place. It's just me in that place don't mesh or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's okay if somebody else in that place mesh
Yeah.
fine. You know, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with any aspect of it. It's just pieces that don't mix.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, did you have, I think you had a couple of announcements or there was a couple things you wanted to mention too, yeah. And how,
Yeah. So yeah, what was that? Sorry.
oh, sorry. And then I was going to say, and also maybe talk about how could people get in touch with you for if they wanted to get an astrolocation reading or something like that.
Yeah, those sessions are up and running. So my Instagram is Bethany Nicole Love, and you can book sessions right from the link in the bio there. My website is bethanynicole.com, and that also has booking links. And that is where, when my book becomes available, which should be next week, that'll be the Amazon link and all of the things. So it's really kind of the one-stop shop for all of the things.
Cool. And yeah, and just say a couple more things about your book. I know we talked about it a little bit, but just maybe a little bit more about title and kind of what it's about and what people could expect from it.
Yeah, so it's called The Secret Energetics of Relationships. And it's actually very similar to kind of what we've been talking about. It's just the behind the scenes things of what goes on in relationships. So it takes you through pretty much the entire process. So it takes you through really practical things like using energetics to work the dating apps and to make them work for you instead of against you. It creates my process, the dating funnel, which shows you how to kind of create your own reality and paradigm around dating. It shows you that you might have created your own paradigm around dating and not even know you're in it. And just sort of all the ways to do that. And then it takes you through when you are in a relationship, how you can kind of take that to a higher level, higher emotional ranges, and how to connect more deeply and just all of those things using energetics. And then it also has a section, the final piece is that if you are parting ways in a relationship, how to stay energetically aligned and what kind of the practices are behind that as well. So it takes you through all of the stages pretty much of a relationship and the energetics along the way. So it's pretty comprehensive. Just like if you have anything going on, you know, you can see different ways to bring the relationship in, create the higher evolution of the relationship, and then if it ends, how to kind of let that go more gracefully and how to kind of recalibrate yourself during that process too.
Cool. Okay, that's cool. All right. Well, there'll be a link to your website in the show notes, and then the book comes out, what did you say, next week? So
Yeah, I've got the final edit, and then it should be next week by the latest.
cool. So the end of May. Perfect.
Yeah, perfect Gemini season
Yeah.
publishing. And on my MC line, work, love it, love it.
You're right on time,
Right
astrologer.
on time. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you, Bethany. This has been, I knew it would be fun because we always have fun when we get to talk. And I think there's a lot of really good, interesting stuff here for everybody too.
I think so too. Yeah.
Yeah, so thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thanks to everybody who's listening, and check out Bethany's website, bethanynicole.com, and then check out her book. I know I'm going to definitely check out your book as soon as it's out. And then, yeah, thanks so much for being here, and we'll talk to you all again soon.